Good morning, good afternoon, good day, greetings and salutations, and might I add, a mighty helping of welcome to the Safe Room featuring Security SideQuest. My name is Tristan Watty, and I'm joined by a very special guest today. I would also add that he is marvelous, he's determined, he is a threat modeler at heart. I am joined by David. How's it going today, David?
Hey, Tristan. Thanks so much for having me today. How are you?
Doing all right. It is Monday, so I would say it's a happy Monday, right? So it's always good to start off with that, and also to say hi to everybody as well. It's like Ari. But for those people who are unlike Ari and it's their first time joining, I would reintroduce myself as Tristan Watty, and I come to you from the Professional Services Division of AWS, where we help to accelerate customers' journey to the cloud in a secure manner, fashion, and way. And David, where are you coming from in the AWS organization?
Yep. So Tristan and I are colleagues. We're both in professional services. And he and I have worked together in a couple of different workshops in the past. We've done some incident response and what we call some security pitfalls with generative AI.
Yeah. And some of you might be saying, where's Russ? Well, Russ will be back next week. He is currently on a beach somewhere, as we like to say when we're talking about, just IT in general. But we have a DevSecOps person today. And that's kind of why David is here from that point, because he's seen a lot of stuff, right? He's seen and spoke with a lot of customers and delved in it with a security, mindset. But before we get into all of that, we always want to ask some very specific questions. That first question is always, where are you dialing in from? Where are you tuning in from? Where are you listening from? We always like to know that piece, right? See if you're in tomorrow or yesterday, depending on what time zone you're in. And as always, we also have a second question. And David, this question is the very epitome of questions that we have to answer on this show. You may ask what that question is. And it's, what's your favorite sandwich?
Yeah, so that's actually kind of a hard question to answer. Being a New Jersey native, there's a lot of sandwiches in the area. So I'd either say like a sub from Wawa, or if you're close to Rutgers, you could try out a fat sandwich. Nice. Those are pretty interesting. It's basically taking every single fast food that there is and wrapping it inside of a hood. Not great for you, but tastes good.
It's great at the moment, right? You live in the moment of time of when we're eating. And then
that's right.
Yeah, later, not so much. But that's a good choice. And it's also make me kind of hungry. But for me, I always go with that debate of what makes a sandwich. And kind of is a hot dog considered a sandwich? So I will bend both lines and say a peanut butter and jelly hamburger. Yes. It has
all the peanut butter on a hamburger, but never jelly.
Yeah, you have to try it. It's with a little like specific type of cheese right in between. It kind of hits the spot. And I also say, Harry, watching from LA, as always. And Ruben, yeah, that's a nice choice as well, depending on where you're coming in from. But before we get everybody a little bit more hungry than they already are, we should dive into today's topic, right? And for you who joined last week, thank you, because you're back this week. Well, and if you didn't, well, the topic was around shifting left. We had an achievement unlock last week when it came to figuring out what DevSecOps is as a holistic approach. Now, we're going to take it one step further and beyond. And if you get that reference, 10 billion points to you. And the title of today's episode gives you a little hint of which direction we're going, because it's toss a scan to your pipeline, advanced DevSecOps concepts. So if you watch the Witcher series, that's kind of a little nod, tip of the hat, or anything in between that. So it really delves into kind of the fundamentals of what See, it's Monday. I can't even talk. I didn't have enough coffee. DevSecOps is. It's getting to that point of, hey, what are pipelines? What is my company? What is my organizational mindset when it comes to scanning, right? And going from there. So when we start to go down that route, we start to think of, hey, what are some of the key components that we need to think about? And today we're going to touch upon a couple of strategic areas, as we like to say. And one is, okay, if we built pipelines last week and kind of the fundamentals, where do we go? How do we enhance our existing pipeline structure, right? And that mainly involves, what is the security scanning capabilities within your CI/CD? Right? What tools you're integrating? How are you kind of diving deeper into code analysis? And it can incorporate a bunch of different things, especially when you get to the tool integration side of it, because it's not just AWS tool sets. What we see customers doing is integrating with a variety of different tool sets. And it really comes to their workflow. I don't know, Dave, what are you seeing when it comes to kind of like streamlining and kind of tool integration as a whole?
Yeah, I would say like if we took a step back, right, we kind of first want to always talk about where the customer currently is in their journey, right? Because depending on that strategic approach is really depending on their maturity, right? Like something that I'm seeing currently at my customer right now is, let's say they're maybe in the intermediary phase where they have their pipelines, they have some scanners, right? But some of the challenge is really running at scale, right? Like where are the bottlenecks? Who are the approvers? Can I get a hold of that person, or do I have to work with an offshore team to get a pipeline approved and reviewed and pushed out to development? So those are some areas that I'm currently seeing right now as far as like challenges with DevSecOps, right? Other things that I've seen too is we'll talk a little bit about security culture and trying to relay that message to developers and other members of your team, both technical and non-technical. Also, we mentioned some tools. We got to think about tool fatigue as well. And also just thinking about like, how do we stay up to date with threats, right? Like just because a scan passes, it doesn't mean that the code you're pushing out is safe. So those are just a couple of thoughts that I've had around this topic.
Yeah. And you kind of hit the nail on the head when it came to the security culture. And kind of, it's not just the security person, it's everybody, right? It's people focus on the sec part of it, but the DevOps, right? You have all these different areas that you have to encompass, along with, hey, who from an account side is kind of looking at this thing and kind of owning it from a customer perspective. And I use customer in that way because when you usually deal with mature organizations, they usually have like a platform team or somebody that kind of delivers this on a platter to the developers to kind of build off of. And they're the customers within the customer. And what you want to do is make sure that those customers all understand what security from a target state strategy is being applied within your organization. And it's kind of a cultural shift. So that's where we start to delve into, okay, what are some practical feedback mechanisms those different customers can use and leverage within their pipelines or outside their pipelines, right? Because there's a couple of different ways to look at it based on what David was saying. And then from that, how do we create some actionable items and next steps? And usually we define that from a quantitative standpoint because we like to take the qualitative, turn it into a quantitative security metrics. What are we using? And then what are we using to validate these processes and procedures that we have in place? And the question that I kind of posed to chat and also to David is, when you see or that customer, what from a security scanning standpoint actually blocks deployment? Right? It's an interesting question because it's, how often does your security service actually block something? Do you know the metrics, things of that nature? What are your thoughts, David?
Could you pose the question in another way?
Yeah. So if you have a security scan in your pipeline, is it a warning or is it a hard stop? Preventative detective, right? If we're looking at it that way.
Yeah. Okay. So working in professional services, I always like to just say, it depends, and it really circles back to where the customer is in their journey, right? Typically what we first see when the customer starts on their DevSecOps journey and shifting left, you usually want to take a more soft-handed approach with enabling detective controls, right? So you might have like IAC checks within the pipeline itself, or you might have, a tool pre-pipeline as well, just to give like notifications saying like, background, at least focusing on infrastructure as code, saying, like, well, what you're deploying isn't best practice. We're not going to stop you yet because we know you're working in dev, but you're going to need to go back and address these things before pushing your code into production.
Yep.
So I would say start off with an approach that focuses on detective controls. And as you mature, focus more on preventing pushing of bad code. But that's not to say there shouldn't be other overlapping mechanisms that should work in unison with those detective controls, like peer reviews and all of that kind of stuff as well.
Yep.
And that's pretty easy to adopt early on in the phase as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's the defense in depth approach that we always like to say. I call it Swiss cheese because you rotate the cheese and eventually you cover all the holes. It's kind of that same thing, because you look at an AWS organization and a lot of organizations like, okay, put SCPs. That should help me and do everything. It's like, well, no, that's a guardrail, but it's not everything. You have to bake something inside of it as well, right? When it comes to the IAM roles and resources and all those kind of things. So
it's like building a wall, but then having someone walk around it if they know how to.
Yeah, exactly. Because it can't extend forever unless you build it a certain way. And then when you build it a certain way, then are you helping to enable the speed of development, the velocity, as we call it, when it comes to that? And that's where that joint effort really comes into play. But I think you also have to take a look at what are the basic level of pipeline, right? We talked about it a little bit last week. Well, if we need to enhance our pipelines, we really need to understand the basics, right? It includes kind of coming from the aspect of, okay, let me secure my pipeline infrastructure. If you're using code build and code pipeline, you want to focus on least privilege. And I say least privilege 3 times for the people on the other side of the internet, because when it comes to something like IAM roles, are you following that concept? When it comes to protecting the pipeline artifacts and credentials, are you using that? The asterisk of enhancement really comes to, how do I handle ephemeral items within my environment? Because when you're starting out, everything's kind of static in a way. Now, if you start to think of ephemeral built environments, and then maybe secrets management, or how do I automate security checks? That's how you start to enhance your security pipeline as a whole. And you start to have multiple stages in that pipeline. Not just deploying, but you have pre-checks and reviews, and then you have the human in the loop, depending on what you're actually deploying as a software. And the piece that I would take a second to double click into is permission boundaries. I think that's a key aspect, that if you're looking into how to protect your organization and just figure out how your security is kind of structured, figuring out, okay, what does source IP do and what does principal org ID do? And I leave it generally blank because I want you to delve in and kind of experience, okay, what are these keys? What does it exactly do? Because it's important concepts, especially when you're defining your organization's kind of guardrails, right? And then from there, you start to continue to build into, okay, how do I scan to make sure I did this right? Right? If you're running Terraform, check off, right? You're running IAC code, right? SonarQube or OWASP Zap, something along those lines. Trivy, if you're doing container scanning. And I mention all these because it's kind of that logical point. I just don't want to say this is an AWS specific thing. This is a mentality thing. This is a security just mindset thing. And that's why I like to insert different tools in there, because we have some tools and we'll get to some of them, but it's important to kind of delve into a little bit. What's your thoughts on that, David?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, right? So I would say, at least from the perspective of like, let's think of this a little bit differently. I would say first, we could talk a little bit more about like what kind of metrics we want to be capturing. But also, when I think of how to secure a pipeline, I try to break it into at least 3 core categories just to kind of frame out, where we should be thinking about security, I think of, in terms of pipeline, security outside of the pipeline, everything but the pipeline, right? I think of security of the pipeline, everything that feeds into the pipeline, and then security inside of the pipeline. So if you can kind of think of it in that fashion, you can start to kind of strategize and figure out where some of these toolings, integrations, processes, procedures, governance really comes into play.
Yeah. And that's a very important part too, to break out those different components, because as you mentioned, there's a lot to unpack and it's easy to get overwhelmed. And that's kind of where the gaps start to form, right? Because even if you speak of like in the pipeline and the artifacts of the pipeline, encryption plays into that, right? How are you using something like KMS, customer managed keys, within your environment? And then continuing along those same, the same train of thought is by laying it out that way that you mentioned, now you can focus and kind of start to develop repeatable methodologies within your organization that other people can follow. Because what we've seen is when you have something that needs to get deployed fast, sometimes documentation doesn't come with it. And when the documentation doesn't come with it, somebody goes out on vacation, somebody's on a beach, on an island, or a mountain somewhere, then all of a sudden the pipeline breaks. Well, we'll just bypass this piece of the pipe. We'll just skip this until person comes back. And that's usually where we're running into problems.
You brought up a really good point there, and kind of a way to, meet at the head of kind of where some of these early problems are introduced, right? It's really important as like a security professional, not one person can do the whole job, right? You need to figure out how to enable other people to also champion the security effort. And in AWS, we have a concept called security ambassadors, or champion of sorts, right? And really what the idea here is, as a security professional, you want to try to get everyone on your team on board to think in a similar fashion, right? So what do I actually mean by that, right? It really comes back to a strong security culture and defining perceptions around escalations, right? Like a security person doesn't have 100 eyes. They can't see everything, right? The developer is going to be much closer to the code than you ever theoretically could be if they're the ones writing it, right? But if you start speaking the same language, have similar terminology, and you point out that, escalations are a good thing within the culture, it's something that should be, praised as opposed to like, punished when things don't work. You have to take more of a proactive approach as opposed to a reactionary approach, and enabling people to, talk. Again, I guess this is the safe room, right? In a safe space where you can actually talk about security topics.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that would kind of hit a lot of those items that you're bringing up. I would say it would reduce a lot of security surprises on projects and on teams.
Yeah, and that's the main thing, is there's no surprises, right? Unless it's somebody's birthday. But that's kind of the main theme that you want to go through, is you want to make sure everybody's, to your point, speaking the same language. Everybody has documentation. Everybody has something as simple as a diagram, right? That's something that's often overlooked, is like, hey, do you have a diagram of your application? Can we talk about it, right? Of just saying how it works, because just something simple like that can stem so many conversations. You've probably seen this as well, David, when you are working with customers and you're like, all right, can I see kind of the flow? And it's like, well, we don't have the flow documented yet. And it's, well, let's build one, right?
Yeah,
that's the important part.
The code is the documentation.
Yeah, and I know automate everything, but sometimes you need a visual, because I know we can dip our toes into threat modeling, but just having, the diagram, the architecture,
the layout of the AWS components, or let's even say like a UML diagram or something like that, to show, the relationships between, the different components.
Exactly. Because then what you can do is you can always add stuff to it. And if you think about how you integrate maybe AWS native tools and services, you can think of, if you're leveraging something like Guard Duty and Security Hub, maybe you can think about something like Macy, right? And it's like, oh, we have these S3 buckets. Do they have sensitive information? Well, now we can talk to it because we have this diagram that we could point at on the screen and say, maybe we look at Macy. And also you start to get into those third-party integration pieces, right? To just to consider, right? It's like, all right, we're using SonarQube. How does it integrate? That's always the question. How does it integrate? So what have you seen?
Yeah, there's a lot of, as far as security, oh, sorry, Tristan. Yeah, as far as security of, there are a lot of other things you touched upon, like what are the risks of other tools? Like, there's a lot of stuff around, the risks of third-party libraries being introduced to code, right? So that should be a part of at least your understanding of the code itself and how that interacts in your environment. Other things of security of the pipeline that I've seen also, right? This is probably a low-hanging fruit item that should be addressed immediately, if it hasn't been so already, is really making sure that you're leveraging private repositories, right? If your code is accessible by anyone with a GitHub credential, that's probably one of the first items that should be tackled, right? So it kind of ties back into the least privilege principle that you talked about earlier, Tristan. Yeah, and then the other one too is, having pre-commit hooks, effectively making sure that when people are pushing code into the pipeline, it's not perpetuating any credentials or any other secrets that shouldn't be visible.
Yeah, and the other thing is when it comes to kind of these checks, before something gets pushed in, it's having the mentality of maybe including a security person in that workflow. Because sometimes what you have is developer pushing to developer. And maybe having a two-pronged approach where you have a developer reviewer and a security reviewer before something gets pushed into an upper environment. I think is an important concept that sometimes I've seen customers go down the path of, well, this person reviewed it and approved it. But maybe they're looking at it from a different lens because security is looking at the holistic picture opposed to just the individual application picture where, something like a quad zero might not be the best thing to push out into the environment because of X, Y, Z, right? Those kind
but it's in dev.
Yeah, exactly. And how fast does dev end up in prod? I think as fast as you hit the commit button, right? That kind of thing.
Yep.
So those are definitely things you need to look at and kind of go down the route of. And it's gates, but we can talk a couple different ways because when you think of setting up security gates, you think of like, okay, this is a hard stop. This is going to slow down everything. But I don't think it needs to slow down. It's more of, do you have a check and a balance? And you can automate some of these functions. You can have human reviewers in the loop, things of that nature, right? So how do you deploy a blocking check versus a non-blocking check? So yeah, a couple things like that. I don't know if you've seen that within your experiences of when you speak with customers, oh, this is going to slow it down. We can't have this in place.
Oh, of course. I just wanted to touch upon, some of the automated checks as well. So, I'm sure we'll dive a little bit deeper into topics like static or SAST scans. You can actually put them as a step within a pipeline. And, if it hits a certain number of high vulnerabilities, you could say, code couldn't be pushed. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like an email gets sent out, someone reviews it. It could just be like developer gets feedback, developer fixed code, developer tries again.
Yeah, exactly. And there's so many triggers that you can go off of. But this is kind of where I see kind of decision paralysis start to come in. It's like, okay, what route do we take then? And then it's either we implement everything and it slows down, or we implement nothing and then it speeds up, but then there's a problem and we have to revert back because something happened. Right? We're trying to avoid that something happening, right? When you start to think of these security gates and kind of, I would also add compliance validation gates as well. Right? You can have something like config rules, to David's point, right, where it's evaluating these different resources you're provisioning. That's an important part of the puzzle as well. But overall, once you figure that piece out, then you can start to speak about, okay, how do I do this? What tools do I use? What are the configurations of those tools? And starting to delve a little bit more, because you often see the decisions tree kind of being worked out live, I should say, where it's, okay, we need to manage secrets. Okay, do we use parameter store? Do we use secrets manager? Do we use Vault? Do we use something else? Right? And you kind of see it spiral off, and 100 meetings later, something occurs, right? So it's often a funny conversation to kind of just say out loud. And that stems from the culture and speaking the same language and things of that nature. So I don't know if you had any experience when it comes to that tool configuration and management portion.
Yeah, do you want to go ahead and dive into some of the recommended tools? Is that the...
Yeah, so if you have, a couple of recommended tools that we could dive into now, we can tease, right, just a little bit.
Yeah, so there's one tool that we recommend heavily here at AWS, which is called Automated Security Helper. Do you have that link ready, Tristan?
Yeah, I can dive into that because it is a fun one to go into. Right, so I think this is the teaser page right here for Ash as a whole, right? So when it comes to this, and this kind of, I think, where David was going, Ash, what is it? What does it do? I think it's an important piece of a lot of workflows and puzzles, right? And we'll put the description up here. And how often do you work with Ash, David?
I would say whenever I'm developing infrastructure as code, this is always a reference that I'm leveraging. It's a really powerful tool. It actually has several scanners built within inside of it, and it has an intelligence capability to actually look at the file types that you're using and use the right scanner. So it's kind of a one-stop shop for most of your security cases. Again, you might need to do a little bit of due diligence to see if there's any gaps within these scanners. A scanner is not going to find everything, right? But I would say if you're trying to figure out, where's a good point to start with static scanning, Ash is a really good place to start. Just if you don't know if there's additional requirements, right? So as Tristan's showing here, it has built-in capability for scanning Git secrets and Python, Jupyter notebooks, Go, C#, and plenty of other languages as well. So if you're on your journey of trying to figure out which tool to use, I would recommend this because it was actually developed in-house and is actually in a public repository. So it's free of cost and open source.
Yeah, and that's an important part that we have to kind of zoom in on, is use it because it has a lot in it, right? We kind of are proponents of it just for the fact of everything David just mentioned of, like, hey, you have all these scanners, leverage them, because what you can do is start to dive into your environment and your code and say, okay, are there any secrets that are just out there? Right.
And not just code, it's the infrastructure as code as well. I forgot to mention that it also does CloudFormation as well as Terraform.
Exactly. And
CDK
that,
as well.
See, and it's funny thing, you just like, and this, and this, and this. This is why we keep saying use it. And one of the things that we want to get to is understanding why. So if we take that step back, as we always like to do, and think about why we use it, well, I think part of it is trying to understand, where does it get applied? Well, luckily, we have something we call a SideQuest Legend Has It. I would put on my announcer voice, but I didn't have enough coffee yet to do so. So we will just delve in. For your first time joining us, the SideQuest Legend is when we dive in to a customer story a little bit deeper to kind of add some context to what we're talking about. So today's journey, today's format, well, we're speaking about that mid-sized retail company. We had that DevSecOps engineer, if you recall from last week, or an individual. Let's call it, I don't know, Cloud Retail, right? Catchy name, we'll use it, catchphrase it, tag phrase it, or whatever we want to do with it. They successfully migrated to AWS. They started to set up their pipelines. They reaped some of the benefits of the cloud native deployment strategy. But as their development team was shipping a lot of features, they started to figure out, hey, we got to add a couple more pieces to this, and a couple more pieces, and a couple more pieces. And then All they had was basic security scanners in place, which is great. It's a starting point. As we left off on last episode, I always like to use that last episode's on. Yeah, I don't know. My inner child comes out because I heard that voice so many times. But if you think of the team running SaaS scans, what happens when they have containers? What happens when they have no standardized approach? What happens when security findings are overlooked? Those are pieces that we have to have a conversation about. And the best way for us to do that is to delve into a conversation of the security SideQuest variety. And how do we do so? David, I know it's your first time on the show, so we will say we do it with our SideQuest board. So if you're new to the SideQuest board, as David is, it's basically a visualization of our customer story, because we have our authenticated user right here. Maybe the DevSecOps person, maybe the developer. But we also have our unauthorized users over here. And everybody's trying to access, one, our secure data and our AWS environment. So the way we kind of tell this tale is, one, we like to, have some dramatic music to start off with, but we also have the concept of starting to understand, hey, how do we get our developer or DevSecOps engineer to a secure spot? So the question I pose to you, David, is when you think of the different customers you dealt with, the different individuals, what do you think, or what's one word that describes your biggest security automation win?
One word to describe my biggest security automation win in regard to what? Just in general?
Yeah, just in general, anything security related that had automation applied.
That's a good question. Security automation win. Are we talking about just like adding a detective control? And maybe in regard to IAM permissions?
Yeah. If you saw something that you had to tell a tale at, let's say, your local, I would say, bar or location hub or something along those lines of, this is the tale of how the customer accelerated their journey. What word would you describe that with?
One word, accelerated. I don't know, Tristan.
Well, we can add one. I would add epic. All right? That seems like a good word to go through. And why do I choose the word epic? Because when you're going down that security route, and feel free in the chat to add any context that you want in your words, is think of an epic security control. What may it do? What will it do? Well, let's think of it this way. If we had a customer trying to journey and secure their AWS environment, maybe we had something like a step function, right? And that step function can do a couple of different things. In the context of our retail scenario, we have a DevSecOps engineer who maybe has inconsistent security scanning. Maybe they have limited pipeline integration, ineffective feedback mechanisms because they're not the consumers necessarily. And maybe there's some knowledge gaps. So you can leverage something like a step function in order to have an event-driven architecture. So if something occurs within the environment, maybe something that is developed or seen in, let's use the concept of Security Hub. I always knock things around when I'm doing it, right? What is Security Hub consuming, right? All these different pieces of the puzzle. Maybe it's consuming all the guard duty, right? And from there, maybe you have your event-driven architecture. So the question I kind of circle back to is, when you're working with customers, David, event-driven architecture, or it could be something as simple as a Lambda function, what have you seen be the most effective?
Got it. Now I'm seeing full picture where we're going with this. Yeah, a great example for this is especially with integrating of the different AWS security services. We have, something called AWS Organizations, which is effectively a large bucket for all of your accounts to uniformly apply governance, right? And within that tool, you can automatically establish and enroll the different accounts into various security services like Security Hub, Guard Duty, Detective, and the plethora of other services, right? One of the automations that I've seen done before and have established myself is building out effectively, an event bus where an alert gets established if someone tries to unenroll one of those accounts from one of those security services. And why is that such a bad thing? And why is it something we should review? Well, effectively, if someone could unenroll themselves from that account, it might not actually push the logs or the events to some of these monitoring dashboards. So therefore, if you're not able to monitor, audit, and log your account, you would not be able to therefore establish, who is the authorized and the unauthorized user in your environment.
Yes, and that's a very important context to add in, because you want to know who's authorized to use your environment. And I put CloudTrail here because it's right there. You have unauthenticated users and you have the authenticated users. What are the mechanisms that you're using in order to kind of swing that back around towards a healthy security posture and environment? And I think another piece is, if something were to occur in said environment, maybe having something like Inspector. You might say, why throw down this random service? Because you're trying to control, right, the authenticated and unauthenticated user. Well, what happens when you start leveraging those serverless, those ephemeral services, right? You need a little bit of extra, I would say, kick. See, I'm still thinking of lunch. But you start to think of how you can leverage something like Inspector to do some scanning, right? And wait, now we start to get into the concept of pipelines and how we have these security checks within our pipeline in order to, one, automate, but also put some security gates and tools and mechanisms that, hey, we have automated checks, we have some manual reviews, but the concept I will put right here is just from, I would say, identity perspective, because that's an important concept that gets you the last step of the way, is focusing on, hey, what is your identity? What's your least privileged principle within your environment? What are the different tools that you're using? Because if you were to think of, and we posed this question last week, but I'll pose it to David as well. If you were to think of, hey, what's your, when you think of security, if security was a video game boss, right? Think of the end boss. Think of it coming to fruition. What would the name of that video game boss be? And I pose this to David. What is the first word that kind of summarizes your security villain boss level?
I would say the inevitable. There is no avoiding the last boss. You have to be prepared.
Exactly. And I also have to be prepared to say thank you. I appreciate that, Robert, for just first joining us and also kind of getting into the spirit of the inevitable. So if we think of the inevitable, how do we stop? How do we prepare in the best manner, fashion, and way? Well, if we think of solution, if we think of outcomes, if we think of our retail that kind of is developing their pipelines, we want to enhance the pipeline security. And we're starting to carve out mechanisms, even in our simple path here, because this is not everything, but it's a step. Having something like Inspector within the pipeline, having identity roles within the pipeline, define certain actions. Well, I would also pose that having something like the developer feedback, not necessarily in the pipeline, but outside the pipeline, because as David mentioned, there's more than just what's in the pipeline, it's what's outside of. And I think that's an important part, that we take the pause and the Zach Morris timeout, as I call it, and kind of zoom back out for a second, because this is an important part of the overall puzzle. When you think of the actual security of the pipeline, there's some pictures that come to your head. But what about those cultural aspects that we spoke about? And that's kind of why we started with it, because it's present throughout every section. So when you start to get to how do I level up my pipeline? Well, you kind of have to level up your security culture as a whole, because there's not necessarily going to be a security gate that you get, hey, you stopped everything, applause and everything. Everything's cool. There's a reiteration, or an iteration, I should say, of your pipeline. Because if we go through the TDR aspect, something happens with your environment, and then you write some playbooks. You say, okay, this is how it's going to happen again. Well, think of your pipeline, right? And what phase that comes in. Because you want to elevate it strategically. And the way you do so is transforming from that reactive security scanning to proactive security engineering. And the key word of that, as you might see, David, is the engineering part, right? And that's coming from the people and the cultural and the process. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, David, when it comes to kind of that feedback and getting your engineers on the same page?
Well, I think part of it, as far as a security professional's responsibility, is to make sure you're actually carving out enough time to actually be acquainted with what the project is about, what is actually in the code base. You have to, it's a shared language, so you have to kind of figure out, what are the names of the, let's say if you're doing object-oriented programming, what are the names of the classes and, the methods and the attributes, right? If you're talking about like reviewing infrastructure as code, the same thing goes, understanding what pieces are in place, right? So I would say that it's a shared effort in communicating. Once established, then we can circle back to answering that question, which was?
Now it starts to get down to that question. And what is the question of the day? It's the same as the word of the day, epic. I'll go back to that. So when we think of how you take that epic approach, you start to think of exactly what David was saying. And a piece of that is trying to elevate your pipeline to a certain way with your people and adding feedback loops. And those feedback loops, what are they? Well, are you speaking, to David's point, the same language, but do you have security feedback mechanism to say, hey, we are trying to do this and this keeps occurring? And that rapid workflow development gets to a part of, or I would say gets to the point of, hey, how do I provide some reasonable feedback that they can implement relatively quickly? We can also say relatively quickly, hello, Jose, thank you for joining us. So by integrating that security feedback into your developer tools, I think establishes a foundation of that security culture that we were speaking about. It also gets to the part of how do I continuously enhance, well, office hours, simple thing like that, right? It's like that's something that you can take 20 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes to say, hey, I'm having this problem that I always run into, and then we keep going back and forth with. I don't know. What is your experience with that, David?
Yeah, office hours is a great one. I can't believe that didn't come straight to mind when I was thinking about that. I was thinking more along the lines of like more formalized approaches, like maybe also, like an after actions review, or like if we're working in agile methodologies, you can also bring things up during sprint reviews. But I would say in general, like a lot of the feedback mechanisms for actually, getting security is just, I would say direct conversation. It's a lot of where it comes from.
Yep, exactly. And you can have integrations that make it a little bit easier, right? You think of Slack or Teams and how you can integrate that into a workflow that maybe there's a findings triage bot or something along those lines that can kind of help educate and elevate to a certain way. And you can also gamify things, right? because gamification, think of it as having a scoreboard of a security variety, right? That everybody can understand within their organization of, hey, this is your account and you are at 99. What is that last 1%? Well, it's these specific items. Okay, how do we do that? And if it's the same thing across the board, now what we can have, meetings and lunch and learns and things of that nature to carve out that last 1%, right? And then you can use different mechanisms to track that. Lambda, DynamoDB is kind of the combo that comes into my head like peanut butter and jelly, but you can also think of other mechanisms, right? We think of JIT, just in time for identity and access, but what about JIT for learning resources, right? Just in time to learn this security piece of information. So things to think about, things to go down, but I think a lot of that kind of stems and goes back to how do we quantify that? How do we put maybe a metric around it, right? So how do we define clear metrics, David?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple of different places that we can go in thinking about metrics, right? Some of the AWS native tools that we've already mentioned actually capture metrics. We have things like AWS config, right? If you define a rule, it'll tell you how many resources are not in compliance, right? We talked about automated security helper, again, which is a SaaS tool, which has the ability to scan code and actually compile and build a readable formatted security findings list, which is classified into like high, medium, and low risk. And you can use those numbers in defining steps within a pipeline, saying if there's any high findings, close, don't allow the pipeline to push, right? So you can use those metrics to kind of, take it a step further and effectively create like a security risk matrix, work with business executives and leaders to define like what is the acceptable risk, what is the backlog I can build from the metrics and the findings that I have so that I can prioritize what it is that I need to work on. You really need to work with, I guess, the customer or the development team and really defining what are the no-goes and what are those metrics that actually capture that, as opposed to, measuring for, I would say performance as opposed to activity happening, right? Because if you generate too many metrics, you're also going to get alert fatigue. And you just want to make sure that you're measuring against the things that you actually want to be fixing.
Exactly. And one of those things that you can measure is kind of, to your point, is, hey, do we have health metrics around like the pipeline itself, right? In order to make sure things that are blocked are continuously blocked and keep going along that same thought pattern, because you can dive deep into metrics and talk about mean time and things of that nature. You can also get into the services side, as David mentioned, of like, okay, we have CloudWatch, custom metrics that you can have security findings with. But the main takeaway that we're trying to get to today, especially when we're thinking about how do we enhance and kind of go through our pipeline and develop the metrics, is what do we have defined within our target state security strategy from our overall environment standpoint? It's an important part of the puzzle that we're trying to get through. So when we're thinking of this, I think another way to look at it is kind of what are the common pitfalls that we've seen that we can share. I think from at least my standpoint of seeing the different customers is they kind of look at security second, right? And what I mean by that is we have to do this application, then we'll run it by security. And then with that run it by security, then it seems like a roadblock instead of being hand in hand throughout the way, right? To our earlier points, because by being hand in hand, it allows for one, less friction, but two, it acts as an accelerator, because now you can proactively address common challenges within the environment, right? And it can also prevent security tool sprawl. And why I mention that is because me as a security person has a vague idea of what you're doing. Now, let me just implement tools just to try and catch all. And then when you implement tools like that, Now you have excess logs, and now you have all these tools to manage it. Oh, how do I visibly see this metric? All right, those are the kind of things I think of. But what do you see as common pitfalls, David?
Well, I talked about alert fatigue. I think that's a really big one. And I think you really hit the nail on the head with kind of running at scale. Architecting the first time is, maybe a little bit more time intensive at first, but if you don't have time to build it a second time, you need to build it right the first time.
Yeah.
And I would say, work with as many of your stakeholders, to do the appropriate planning and analysis of what needs to be built before actually just starting to put something together.
Yeah, exactly. And the one other tidbit I would say is try and combat the security theater, right? And what I mean by that is, hey, focus on risk reduction metrics rather than raw finding counts, right? Because it's say, hey, we found 1 million threats. Well, how many of those you reduce? We'll get back to you, right? Those are the kind of things that you start to hear, and you're just like, well, let's figure out, to David's point, how can we do this right or to best practices and standards the first time? So as we go through the process of maturing our developers, our applications, our overall approach, then we can reiterate or iterate. I keep saying reiterate. I got to reiterate it to myself. But when you
security is a reiterative process.
Yeah, exactly. I think we should coin that and get T-shirts and hats of that because it makes sense.
That's a good name for your next episode.
Yeah, it's a reiterative process. All right. When you think of shifting left and all these different items, these are all the things that come to your mind. And I think a way to also look at this is, hey, all right, we spoke about a couple of different kind of real trajectories that we could go down as an organization. Now, I think the way forward is, how do we get to a point of understanding? And how do we get to a point of, okay, all of my people know what to do? Well, first I would say certifications. That's always a good thing. Always, a shout out to the CERT team. And also shout out to us for subscribe, and all those things that you like to do. But what I also mentioned is knowledge quest. And what is a knowledge quest? Well, it's just exactly what it says, going on a quest of knowledge. And how do you do that? Well, you just dive into an article, a blog, or architecture. But for this week, if we're talking about leveraging automation, I think we have to continue our knowledge quest that we started last week of shifting left, the mentality, the chronicles, the journey, the legend. And kind of how do we begin that? Well, as all things do, with L100 stuff. How do we unlock the achievement of security initiate? Well, it really gets to the point of just figuring out, what does something like Security Hub do? Do you know the terminology? And this is kind of where we're going with the cultural aspect of making sure that we understand the different concepts that come with AWS and the native tool sets. Because if you're trying to figure out, okay, OCSF, what does that stand for and what does it do? And I started to go down the Cotton Eye Joe route. But what you're trying to get to is just understanding the keywords, understanding the services, the functionalities, because now you can start to talk to and understand and explain to your developers, okay, this is what CSPM does. This is what the open cybersecurity schema framework does. Because what does that do? It opens the conversation to other services. Because if you think of OCFF, now you can start to get to the route of, okay, Security Lake. What is Security Lake? How do I use it? Well, you remember that OCFF concept that we understood and kind of spoke about? Now you can dive a little deeper. And then you do the same thing again with something like config. You have compliance folk, and I also say shout out to all the compliance folk out there. We want to understand, hey, are these resources in compliance? Right? And the other, I would say, cheat code is go to the security section of all the documentation and kind of read through it and understand, hey, config, how does it work? key aspect. And you start to get into features like, hey, the identity, the policy actions, things of that nature. This is how you eventually level up to the point of a pipeline defender. Because now you have the culture inside of you. You have a basic understanding. Now you can start to get to some of the fun security topics, even though all security topics are fun. Disclaimer. But you start to go down the route of understanding a little bit deeper into different benchmarks and policies and guidelines. And I pose this question to David: how often do you look at the NIST SP and then PCI DSS and all these different things when it comes to preventative detective controls?
Yeah, I mean, quite often. So usually my approach is, especially in, depending on where the customer is in their journey. If we're talking about like service adoption, let's say the customer says, I've listed maybe 100 services. Amazon has plus 500, something like that now, right? And they're trying to figure out what's the next service I should enable, right? And you say, well, what are the frameworks that you're legally abided to follow, right? Like if we're working with government, it's going to be NIST. A lot of other customers use NIST as well. Financial services, PCI. You can go ahead and look through these documents. These are just kind of like, I would say, guidelines, legal guidelines, right? You got to follow them. These are just items that your environment should be compliant with in order to meet those compliance and regulatory items, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, like if you're trying to like adopt a service, you should be able to, just look through the list of the documentation, and as you see in brackets there, it calls it out by service name of like the required configuration settings for each of them. So
yeah,
it's just kind of a point in trying to figure out like, controls or best practice configuration settings.
Remediations, things of that nature, ways to move forward. And this is how you become that pipeline defender, right? Is just understanding, okay, what do I have to do from an organizational standpoint, from my company standpoint, and starting to go from there. Because eventually you get to the point of leveling up to security automation legend, right? Because this is when you have all of the aura, right? This is where you build all your aura from your knowledge quest, and then you become this legend. Well, you start to go down the route of, okay, now I can manage all of my accounts a certain way, manner, fashion, way, because I leverage items like maybe the SRA, the security reference architecture, in order to better structure and better implement and enhance not only my pipeline, but the tools that I'm using throughout. And starting to get to a point where, okay, now let me go to the code aspect of it. Let me go to, how do I figure out this piece at a more complex level, right? And you can take a second to dive into Control Tower and kind of some of the default guardrails. But now you want to get to the customizations because you're a legend. And I think that's where we take that step back out and start to think about it, right? So we recapped a bunch of stuff here. But one of the main takeaways is, hey, what are you doing within your organization from a security standpoint, from a DevSecOps standpoint? What are you doing from a documentation standpoint? But there's one last thing. But before I say that, David, if you had one takeaway that you would leave the audience speechless with, what would it be?
I would say the call to action I would provide is really take a look at the well-architected framework, and there's a specific pillar you can take a look at for AppSec. So we tried to touch upon as much of this as we could within an hour, but there's a lot of reading there and some suggestions that you can follow up on in your DevSecOps journey.
Yeah, and feel free to let us know if you completed any of the knowledge quests. We always like to know. Reach out to us on LinkedIn or the social media platform of your choice. And since Russ is not here, the last thing I would say is create an incident response plan. I always say it to Russ, what do we do? And that's what he suggests. So that's what we have to do. But thank you, David, for joining us today. You've been a great host and a great mentor to the people who are coming up in their DevSecOps journey. But until next time, keep on side questing, keep building XP, and keep on having fun with security. Take it easy.